The station clock struck 11:50 p.m. King's Cross had grown quiet, the way only train stations do late at night. The daytime rush had vanished. Shops had shuttered, cleaners pushed brooms across tiled floors, and loudspeakers echoed with last calls. David Clark adjusted the strap of his bag. He was a 24-year-old student, exhausted from a week of coursework and shifts at a cafe. Missing his earlier train was bad luck, but the timetable listed one last service to Newcastle, midnight sharp. He hurried down the platform. The air was cold and damp, his breath visible in the fluorescent light. The boards above flickered. Final service, Newcastle, 0000. The train sat waiting, lights dim, engines humming faintly. David boarded one of the middle carriages, expecting to see a handful of late-night travelers. But as he walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoed against empty walls. Not a soul in sight. He picked a window seat, shivering slightly. The seats smelled faintly of dust and old fabric, as if this train wasn't used often. He checked his watch. 11:57. 3 minutes to go. At the last second, just before the doors closed, another figure appeared on the platform. A tall man, slim, draped in a long black overcoat. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. He didn't rush. He stepped inside, as if he knew the train would wait for him. David glanced at him nervously. The man didn't look his way. He simply walked past and sat several rows back, where the shadows of the carriage hid his face. The train lurched forward. Midnight struck. For the first 20 minutes, David barely thought about the man. He pulled out his phone, listening to music, staring at the blur of night outside. But gradually, something strange tugged at his attention. The train wasn't stopping. No platforms, no town lights, no announcements, just endless black countryside sliding past. He leaned toward the window. He needed answers. He slid out of his seat and began walking down the carriage, glancing at doors for a conductor. But each door he pushed open led only to another empty carriage. No staff. No passengers. No voices. By the fifth carriage, dread set in. He was alone. Entirely, impossibly alone. When he returned to his seat, his heart almost stopped. The man in the overcoat was no longer at the back. He was sitting directly across from him. David froze in the aisle, skin prickling. He hadn't heard footsteps. He hadn't heard a door. The man was just there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The train clattered on, lights flickering overhead. Finally, David forced a nervous smile. His voice came out thin. "Hey, do you know if this train's stopping at Newcastle?" The man tilted his head. Slowly. Too slowly. His face still half hidden in shadow. And then he smiled. The man's smile lingered too long. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't even human. It was a quiet stretching of the lips that showed too many teeth. David sat back down slowly, forcing himself not to break eye contact. His heart thudded against his ribs, his palms sweating. "Look," he stammered, "I just need to know if we're stopping. I think there's been a mistake." The man didn't answer. He blinked once, an unnaturally slow blink, like a reptile closing its eyes, and then returned his gaze to the window. For several long minutes, neither of them moved. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. David turned his eyes forward, trying to steady his breath. He's just a weird passenger, that's all. Stop imagining things. But then came another realization that made his skin crawl. The reflection in the window. In the glass he could see himself clearly. Pale face, wide eyes, his body shifting nervously. But where the man should have been, there was nothing. Just an empty seat. David jerked his head back around. The man was still sitting there, staring straight ahead. His reflection didn't exist. David's mouth went dry. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like stone. Finally, he forced himself up, nearly tripping as he stumbled into the aisle. He moved quickly through the carriage door, heart pounding. The connecting corridor rattled as the train hurtled forward. He stepped into the next carriage. Empty. And the next. And the next. Each carriage identical. Rows of deserted seats, flickering fluorescent lights, the same faint smell of dust. It was as though the train stretched on forever. A looping corridor with no end. David stopped, pressing a hand against the glass window of the door. Outside, the world whipped past in a blur of black. No lights, no villages, no station platforms. Just endless countryside. The monitor above glitched, static crawling across the screen, before displaying the same two words again. In transit. David's throat closed. He spun around. The man in the overcoat was sitting at the far end of the carriage. David hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't heard footsteps. But there he was, motionless, watching. David backed away slowly, clutching the cold metal rail beside him. The lights overhead flickered once, twice. On the third flicker, the man was suddenly closer, just 3 rows away. David gasped, stumbling backward. He slammed through the next door and broke into a run. Carriage after carriage blurred past. His breaths came sharp and ragged, every muscle screaming. But no matter how far he ran, the carriages repeated. The same upholstery, the same litter on the floor, the same silent rows of seats. It was endless. Finally, David collapsed into a seat, chest heaving. He pressed his hands into his hair, gripping tightly, trying to calm himself. This isn't real. I fell asleep. This is just a dream, just a whisper cut through the silence. Low, rough, right beside his ear. Not a dream. David leapt up, spinning around. The seat behind him was empty. The carriage was empty. And yet, he could feel it. The presence. Breathing. Watching. He bolted forward again, slamming through the next set of doors. This time, instead of another carriage, he found himself...
The photo crumpled in a gust of cold wind.
And then he felt it. A hand. Cold, clammy, gripping his shoulder. Slowly, trembling, David turned. The man was inches from his face. His eyes were black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, void of anything human. His lips stretched wide, revealing jagged, unnatural teeth, and he whispered in a voice that crawled into David's bones. You shouldn't be here. The lights went out. The cabin shook violently. Metal groaned like it was being torn apart. The air turned bitterly cold, every breath a fog. David pressed himself against the wall, staring at the figure inches away. Those black, empty eyes seemed endless, pulling him into a darkness far deeper than night. He shoved the man away and bolted back up the stairwell. His shoes pounded against the steps, lungs burning, panic exploding through every nerve. He burst into the carriage again, but something was wrong. The train was no longer modern. The seats were torn, upholstery shredded, windows were cracked, smeared with grime. Rust crawled across the walls. It was as though decades had passed in seconds. David stumbled forward, desperate to find the exit. He slammed at the doors, yanking handles, but they wouldn't budge. Outside the windows there were no fields anymore. Only blackness, endless and suffocating.
A faint sound rose behind him. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. David turned. The man in the overcoat was walking toward him now. For the first time he moved, jerky, unnatural strides, like a puppet on broken strings. David backed into the corner, his chest heaving. "Please," he begged. "I just want to get off." The man stopped only a few feet away, his head tilted, that unnatural smile curling again. "You are home," he whispered. The lights flickered. For a split second, David saw them, rows of other passengers seated all around him. But they weren't alive. Their skin was gray, their faces slack, their clothes decades out of date. Each one stared blankly forward, as if waiting for a journey that would never end. And then the vision vanished. The seats were empty again. The train gave a violent jolt. David fell to the floor, clutching at the rails as metal screamed and sparks flew outside the windows. For a moment he thought the train was crashing. But it didn't. It just kept going. Faster. Deeper. He dared one last glance at the man. The figure loomed over him, eyes like pits, voice like the rattle of the tracks. "Next stop. Never." The lights went out. Some say the midnight train from London to Newcastle never stopped running, that the passengers who boarded in 1975 never found their destination. And neither will you, if you step inside. So the next time you're standing alone on a platform, and a final train arrives, ask yourself this: are you boarding a way home? Or are you buying a one-way ticket to nowhere?